Thanks for the intro. And I'm going to apologize. I'm going to try to get through this with a voice that is, over the weekend, just trying to kill me. I am Brian Hayden. I'm a solution architect. I've spent about 30 years in software engineering, and with this, being kind of like the third phase of software engineering, it's been just a really exciting couple of years with AI. So just a few weeks ago, there was this post that went viral. Got about 80 million views from a guy I hadn't heard of before, but just in a matter of days, it got a lot of views. And the title was "Something Big is Happening." And it was written by a startup CEO, Matt Schumer. And, in it, he compared where we are at with AI to like 2020, pre-COVID, when everything kind of blew up in the world. And the message was basically something massive is shifting in technology right now. And I'll be honest, when I was reading it, it seemed a little bit unhinged. So it was written for his family and friends who really aren't in tech, and the surprising, somehow it ended up in everybody's feeds, including mine. So I sat with it for a couple of days, and I wrote a little post on LinkedIn. The title of it was "Nothing Big is Happening in AI." And I meant every word of that. So here's what I actually meant. Matt's writing from inside of San Francisco, inside of his tech, labs, and where innovation is really fostered. He's describing a capability curve that is on the bleeding edge. And he's right about the curve. Models are getting better. The technology is getting faster. Progress that we're experiencing, it's real. But I'm not here to argue with that. What I'm here to say is that this room isn't in San Francisco. We're in Pewaukee, Wisconsin. We're talking about manufacturing floors, in Menominee Falls, service desks, in downtown Milwaukee. We're talking about FinOps here in Pewaukee. And things look like that's the reality on the ground that looks a lot different. So what he's talking about with the capability curve, it's not the adoption curve, and that's different. So that moves at a completely different pace, and the gap between these two curves, that's not really a problem. That gap's an opportunity. And so today we're going to talk about closing that gap deliberately. So 3 years ago, I remember this really well, I was at Microsoft Build, and it was the first Microsoft Build when OpenAI was released, and probably the first one I think that they had that was in person after COVID. And Microsoft announced this massive investment in Mount Pleasant, Wisconsin. Billions of dollars, national headlines, and honestly, it felt like Milwaukee, Wisconsin was going to be the center of the AI universe. But, if you think about it, this was announced in 2022, it's 2026, it's still not online, and that's not a problem, that's just reality. A lot of you probably drove past it, maybe a little quick show of hands if you drove past it today on I-94. You still see the cranes, you still see the fencing. The steady progress that feels slow is not keeping up with the pace that the keynotes or the presentations stated. So that's not really a failure, though. That's reality. It's what it actually takes to do transformation, building infrastructure like this. You need permits. You need the power to get run out there. Labor agreements. And none of that really makes the keynote slide. The reality is that real transformation runs on unglamorous kinds of things. It's concrete. Concrete cures slowly, and so does transformation. So here's the reality. The manufacturers, you guys in this room, we aren't flipping a switch and becoming AI overnight. We have to retrofit ERP systems, and that takes years. We have to run pilots inside of our union agreements that take months for us to negotiate and re-navigate. And we're waiting for the next capital fund cycle to fund our infrastructure. So that's not a lack of ambition, but what it is, it's a responsible transformation that takes into account your real customers, the real problems, real operations, and has real consequences when something actually breaks. So the loudest voices that we're hearing online, they're talking about a thunderclap. And what I see, working with organizations, many of you that I've worked with and are working with today, is something quieter, and it's a little bit more durable. You know, it's AI compounding, and it's compounding slowly and deliberately. So the companies that are laying the right foundations and looking at, like right now, they're the ones that have an advantage, you know, that are going to have an advantage 3 years from now. And so how do you become one of those? So I'm going to do a little bit of a poll. I want to know a little bit more about you. And I'm going to frame a little bit of how I talk about some of these stories based on, you know, what I see from the audience. But on the screen, you see kind of 5 different stages that I see companies in. And the first one is watching and waiting. These are companies that are evaluating AI. They really haven't started experimenting. And be honest with me, quick show of hands, you know, who's in that stage? What about experimenting? People that are running actual pilots, nothing in production yet, and who's there? A little bit more. What about third? We've got something live. Maybe you've deployed some agents, but you're not quite scaled at the organization. And something that I hear from my customers a lot is, how do I scale this? Can I get a show of hands? All right, fourth. These are, you know, kind of the people that are excelling, you're scaling. You have multiple agents in production. And the thing that I hear most in this group is that we need governance to make it accelerate faster. Who's in that group? And what about the last group? Honestly, not sure. We're still just trying to figure it out. Well, a few of you are honest. I think maybe a third of you raised your hand in total, so I'm not getting a really good understanding. But let's take a look where I think most of the organizations are. I would say, generally speaking, if you're in the first 2, you know, buckets, don't feel bad. You're where most companies are, and I mean that, you know, as a compliment. You're not chasing headlines. Most of you are trying to be deliberate. But this is kind of what Concurrency is seeing across our clients, and we've done a little bit of polling with them, informal, not like a fancy study. You know, majority of customers are still kind of in that first 2 buckets. And very few have something that's live and actually in production, that's running their business, that's making a huge impact. You know, even fewer are doing the scale problem. We have a couple of customers that are looking to us for some advice on that. But if you're in the first two groups, you're probably there because you have discipline. And that's the instinct to validate before you scale. And that's probably your biggest competitive advantage right now, is taking things methodically. You aren't actually behind if you think about it, looking at these numbers. So don't feel bad about that. You're exactly where a lot of thoughtful organizations are right now. And this isn't really a moment where you want to sprint blindly, but you do have to get the pace picked up a little bit. And it's the moment where we're going to start moving with intention. So don't rush ahead without a plan. You know, speaking of where these customers are, I had this idea for one of my other talks a couple of weeks ago, and I'll give you just a little bit of quick context about me. For those of you who don't know me, I'm definitely an avid outdoors guy. I like to hike. I like to hunt. I'm out in Colorado in the mountains. I do a lot of fishing on Lake Michigan. And that's kind of how my brain works, and it like processes things. So I understand the world kind of really through that dirt and mud and, you know, kind of being in the outdoors and thinking. And so when I talk about AI, I use a lot of analogies that make sense to me, and I'm hoping that they can kind of make a little bit of sense to you. So one of these analogies comes from like the old TV show Gold Rush. And anybody remember the Gold Rush? Like I was kind of addicted to that. But in Alaska. And it wasn't really the drama, but it was the equipment that they used that started to make sense to me. The way that the miners chose their tools, often very innovatively, they scaled their operations and managed risk, was kind of a good lens for me to like think through like AI. And so here's a framework that I thought of that could help organizations understand things a little bit clearer. So I broke down organizations into 3 different camps. The first camp was where most organizations really are right now. They're using commodity AI tools. And the commodity one for me is table stakes. People are dipping their toes in the water, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it is a commodity position. And so if everybody's doing it, which most of you probably are, then it's just table stakes at this point, and it's not really any kind of a competitive advantage. So Camp 2, that's where most of the energy is right now. That's where the excitement, that's where people are talking. In Camp 2, this is broad experimentation, multiple pilots. People are trying to figure out what this means for their organization. They're spinning up agents, they've got some excitement. And honestly, this is where I see a lot of wreckage right now. People making mistakes and stumbling and falling down. And then in Camp 3, it's the destination. Purpose-built AI aligned to the mission of your business and deeply integrated into your high-impact workflows. So this is where people want to get that's going to give you a sustainable advantage. But the problem is, how do you get from Camp 1, where most of us are, to Camp 3? And a lot of people try to jump from Camp 1 to Camp 2. And the hiking analogy I have is out in Colorado, that's going to give you altitude sickness. So you move too fast, and you're not going to have the right governance rails in place in order to really absorb that kind of transformation. And so you're going to make mistakes. And so my caution for you is, if you're in Camp 1, focus on what it's going to take to get to Camp 2. And if you're in Camp 2, focus on what it's going to take to get to Camp 3. So here's where we're going to spend the next 45 minutes or so. Think about it, this is like kind of your Alaskan map. Lay the land before we start getting the excavators out and start digging things up. Let's start a little bit with a sharp kind of vocabulary. There's a lot of people in this room. I was looking at the attendees coming in, CEOs all the way down to interns and people in school. So let's just make sure that everybody in the room is speaking the same language when we talk about LLMs and RAG and all those terms. And then we'll kind of move into a control model that I've started using. And it's a framework for helping organizations to decide how much autonomy an agent is going to use. And then from there, we're going to go to the agent portfolio itself, which I think is what a lot of people were looking forward to, your operating portfolio. And then we'll close here with like a 30, 60, 90-day little session, give you some practical things that you can take back to your office tomorrow morning. After this session, you're going to have a couple of opportunities to go a little bit deeper. And I just wanted to make sure that I planted the seeds for those. So the governing and securing AI at scale session, that's going to build directly on this control model that we're going to talk about. The data and AI session shows really how your data foundation is going to determine what that ceiling, this ladder that I was talking about, what the ceiling is going to be. And then we'll finish with that panel with the 3 regional leaders that are going to help you understand how they're making the real decisions that they're making right now. Yeah, I can tell you, because I know each one of them, they're not hypotheticals, they're going to be real stories. So let's start with that vocabulary. Large language model. I know that some people are here going to understand what most of these terms mean, but I want to make sure that if you do know them, that's great, but I just want to make sure you're using the same definition that I am. These words get kind of thrown around pretty loosely. So first one, large language model. These are tools that will predict and produce language. They're super useful, and where most of the hype really started. But the challenge with LLMs is that it doesn't know anything about your business. It doesn't know what your data looks like. It doesn't know what your documentation or SOPs look like. That's not what it is. And it certainly doesn't know anything about what your policies as an organization are. So it's a dangerous tool to a certain degree because it's not trusted by default. Next, let's talk about RAG. And this stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation. This is a fantastic tool that started to, once we had LLMs, could retrieve information from your knowledge, your company, and actually answer it in a way that makes sense. So now your SOPs and your customer data are part of that response and a part of that cycle. So think of it just an LLM plus your context. The third is an agent. And this is more than just a model. Similarly, like with RAG, when we said that that's your LLM with knowledge, an agent is essentially LLM with tools. Now it doesn't just answer questions, it actually does things for you. And that's what makes them powerful, but it's also why it requires a completely different level of governance. So finally, there's Copilot. I feel like I have to explain Copilots the most because Microsoft has 72,000 of them. But if you want to think of it a little bit simpler, Copilots are really just a user interface. It's how you interact with your agents on a daily basis. And it's the way they show up inside of like Microsoft 365 or Copilots inside of your ERP or Copilots inside of Service Desk. I'm going to leave this slide with one little key insight. I don't like to think of these, just as product categories. They're actually more like operating roles. So when you deploy AI, you're not just buying software, you're deciding which roles in your organization are going to be staffed by some of these intelligent agents and which ones are going to be remaining in the human lens. So that shift in thinking matters, pretty much for everything that we're going to talk about next. I mentioned a capability curve before, and Schumer was right about this kind of point. The capability curve is real, and it's moving exceptionally fast. So there's an organization out there called Meter. This is, kind of this very new, in the news kind of thing. But what they do is they track the length of real-world tasks that an AI model can complete successfully, end to end, without any human help. So let me unpack that again just a second time. If a task would take a human 10 minutes to complete it, and an AI can complete that task, regardless if it takes it 2 hours, 10 days, or 1 minute, the measurable output of that is that it's a 10-minute task that it was able to complete. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So about a year ago, that number was 10 minutes. Today, the latest Meter ratings, it's up to 5 hours. So agents are now capable of doing 5 hours worth of a human's complexity task. Whether that takes 5 hours or it takes a minute, doesn't matter, but that's how good they are. They can reason through those things. And so this has been doubling roughly every 7 months, and kind of similarly to Moore's Law, we were seeing this like doubling every 7 months. But, it's changing now. Now we're down to, something more like 3 months in terms of how fast this is doubling. But, take a step back and think about this. 1 year ago, AI could handle a 10-minute task. We're talking about 1 year ago. Today, it can complete nearly 5 hours of work. That's a meaningful shift. And I think that's where Matt is really kind of grounded in his statement. The models that we're using today would have been unrecognizable, inconceivable, to what we're capable of doing today. So I'm not here to argue that AI is not progressing, because it is. It absolutely is. But here's what the hype kind of misses. The capability and the adoption, they're completely different curves. And the adoption curve is the one that actually matters to most of the people in this room. That's why you're actually here today. So let's pause and take a look at what some of the actual data says. And this is super recent too. This is from PwC this year already. And they surveyed some global CEOs last year. And about 20% say that they're applying AI extensively to core business functions. Not just experimenting, but actually deploying agents at scale. One of the best, Morgan Stanley, often cited, as one of the most aggressive adopters. They went from a pilot, to just running pilots, to having full rollout in 24 months. I mean, that seems kind of incredible to a certain degree, but also that's the standard of fast. So going back to what we're talking about with concrete curing slowly, fast is definitely a relative scale. Most regulated industries are looking at 3 or 5 years for meaningful AI transformation. And so none of that's really meant to discourage you. What it's meant is to give you some context. The organization that, if your organization is feeling you're behind because you're not moving at the speed of like a LinkedIn feed, you're probably right on schedule right now. And the question isn't really whether you want to move, it's how you move with precision so that you close this gap instead of burning your budget on pilots that are probably never going to get shipped. So what actually separates the organizations that close the gap from the ones that drown in pilots? And I've come up with this control model that I want to share with you. And it's a simple one that you can start using pretty much tomorrow. And so for me, I'm thinking of it as like an autonomy ladder. And there's 5 rungs, and the higher that you climb, the more that you're letting your agent do for you. But it's also the more discipline that you need to have for your agent. And so on the first level 1, they just observe. So this is what most people think of like just your chatbot. It's just summarizing your email. It's just creating your drafts. It's not doing anything meaningfully. And this is where almost everybody starts.
But level 2 is where the agent starts to do things like recommend things. And so it can tell you what to do, but you're the one that's actually pushing the buttons. You're the one that's actually acting on it. And in this case, I would think of it more like a service desk use case where I'm trying to figure out what the problem is, what gear shift do I move, or what part do I have to replace. That's the recommend. But in level 3, we get to prepare. And so now this is where things get a little bit interesting. The agent's going to draft the action, and it's going to give you instructions on what you have to do. That might be something like responding with this email, creating this purchase order, routing this decision. Those are a couple of good examples, but a human approves it before it goes out. And that's important. Many mature enterprise deployments are actually starting to live right in that space, where the agent is actually doing the work under human supervision. But then level 4 is executing in a sandbox. Now we're starting to talk about autonomous agents. And inside that sandbox, we're going to limit what the agent has access to, but they can act now on their own in a really controlled environment. Think OpenClaw for people that are reading the news. Most people that are, well, not most people. I think most people are probably just like willy-nilly doing stuff. But most responsible people are taking OpenClaw and putting it inside of like a sandbox so that it doesn't have access to everything. But there's no real world consequences until you validated the results. You're not really letting it go wild. But this requires testing, it requires simulation, it's going to require validation loops, and we've started to adopt this term called evals, which become really important when you start to have autonomous agents. Now, level 5, at the top, this is where we just let the agents execute in production. They're acting on real systems with real data in real time. But at this point, if you're doing it and doing it right, you've got the guardrails. You're doing logging. You've got human-in-the-loop checkpoints for the right moments. A lot of our systems that we've built at Concurrency intentionally have human-in-the-loop until the last minute. And so if you're thinking about starting, I would say most organizations should start around level 2. A meaningful number of you are already doing or are ready for things to do in level 3. But if you jump straight into level 5 without ensuring that there's the proper guardrails, what I'm seeing right now is that's where most organizations, they pull the plug. Those pilots go there and they die. And so deciding which level is going to fit your agent is important to start with, to make sure that you are governing that across your entire portfolio. Another recent thing, a quick little field report from last weekend. Jack Dorsey from Twitter, also with Block, the company that runs Square and Cash App, he announced that he's cutting more than 4,000 jobs. And that's a very significant portion of their workforce. I think their entire workforce is 10,000 people, and to shift that overnight. But he wrote this really interesting letter that he posted on Twitter, and he was explicit about why he was going to cut the teams. Smaller teams can now accomplish as much as what larger teams used to be able to because of the things that AI tools are able to do for them. I'm not here to judge whether he was making the right call. That's completely Dorsey's decision, and there's a lot of people online that are saying that it's about time that Dorsey makes these kind of calls. But sit with this for a minute. Do you want your organization to be reactive to that kind of move, responding to the competitive pressures after it falls? Or do you want to be the organization that saw that shift coming and had the ability to build the capabilities internally so that your team could move faster when you had that? It's not really a rhetorical question. Most of you are going to answer you want to be ahead of that curve. So the difference between those positions really is having a portfolio and this kind of control model that we talked about before you need one. So a little bit of sobriety here. I'm going to spend a little bit of time. This is the kind of thing that keeps most people up at night, but I think it's really an underappreciated risk right now in enterprise AI, and that's prompt injection. And some of you may have heard that term, and even if you've never really written a line of code or don't plan on writing a line of code, this is something that's important, and here's more or less a simple definition. Prompt injection is an attack when someone hides malicious instructions inside of context or data that your agent is going to read and that the agent then follows those instructions instead of yours. So the attacker didn't hack your model, it didn't hack your software. They hid instructions inside of something that your agent's gonna use. Sometimes it's a document that it reads. Sometimes it could be some information that's in a service ticket. It could be a little bit more malicious than that. But the agent really can't tell the difference between your directive and what the attacker's directive is. So it just sees words, when it gets put together, and that's all it really cares about. We used to have this thing, when I was doing software engineering, SQL injection worked the same way. So this, again, I want to just go back to what I said at the very beginning of this slide, which is this isn't a new problem, but people are building agents right now to help their service desk, to help, to really help internal users or their customers. And these are totally normal workflows that people are doing it in. And they're retrieving normal context and things that people would read, but they're not actually thinking about the ramifications of it because they're so impressed by the wow factor of it. The agent's not doing this because it's evil. It's doing it because it can't distinguish between something that was legitimate and something that has malicious content. But what do you actually do about this? There's really just 4 kind of simple things that you can do right now. Not 40 things that you have to think about, just 4 things that you should start with. And first, input validation, just like we did in the past. Sounds pretty simple, but before any external content gets to your agent, the document, the tickets, the web pages, you have to treat it as it's something that isn't trusted. You have to inspect it. You have to sanitize it. You cannot let the raw content hit that model directly. And there's a lot of tools that are out there that can help you with that. And they've been shipping like this for a long time with these kinds of parsing tools. But the second concept is something we've been talking about a lot too, is least privilege. Your invoice processing agent should never really have access to your HR data, or your customer service agent shouldn't really have access to your financial systems. So give your agents what access that it actually needs for that particular task. Microsoft has made that incredibly easy with the new Agent 365 framework that makes agents essentially an identity inside of your network. Third, make sure that there's a human in the loop. So you have those kind of checkpoints that any action that touches any kind of an external system, if it's gonna send data outside of your environment or reach out to a customer or makes any kind of change that you can't undo easily, make sure that the human has the approval first. Full stop. Don't pass that step. This is your one chance as a circuit breaker. And then fourth, auditing. So can you replay exactly what the agent does? And that's important, replay exactly what the agent did. So there's gonna be some concerns with that because how do I replay something with the exact context and the exact words? Well, there's privacy issues with that, So it's a complex subject, but if you can't replay this and you can't investigate incidents, then you can't prove compliance. And that's important for a lot of organizations, and you're just flying blind at that point. So luckily, the vendors are starting to catch up to this stuff too. So OpenAI, Anthropic, they all have features, things like lockdown mode, that are built in that help deterministically disable tools that get commonly exploited in the ecosystem. So make sure that you're remembering those and incorporating these into your workflows. And remember that altitude sickness that I talked about? Skipping this, it's a really good way to get sick. So guardrails let you go faster. I think that there's this idea that governance will slow you down as an organization and that it's a tax that you're gonna pay to use AI, but it's not. Governance and guardrails are the engine that lets you actually scale. Without any kind of a real governance model, every agent that you build for your team is just gonna be one single one-off. Every deployment that triggers a brand new risk conversation, you're gonna be starting your journey from zero every single time without these kind of guardrails. So when you bake it into the pattern, you build it once, and then you have these things that you can reuse. Those security models, they can incorporate those types of things right into it. You've got policies, you have permission groups, agent sets. Those are things that help you build faster and scale faster. Your second agent's gonna ship faster than your first because you have an approval path that's already built in and it exists. Your fifth, it's going to be faster even still. And they compound as you go through this journey so that trust actually accumulates within the organization. So the organizations that are winning right now, they're not the ones that are just trying to figure this out. They're the ones that are moving faster on day one with agents that they're building. And the ones who built the right foundations early are by, let's say, like day 50, they're moving faster than everybody else when they get to day 100, as if like, you know, they just move faster. So using that altitude sickness analogy again, the ones that are going to be really successful at this one are the ones that are going to let yourselves acclimate at this step. So pause, make sure you get this governance right. And now I want to talk a little bit about like what's going to be our first agent. So to make this real, we need some sort of an operating model. And the framing, you know, for this summit really kind of stated, stop buying AI, start managing agents like a portfolio. So I want to start classifying them by business impact. And for many of you, what does that mean? Is it revenue? Is it cost? Is it risk? Customer service? Operations? It could be any one of those things. What's important to you as an organization? But when you think about these agents, fund them like they're products. Manage them like they're assets. Let me bring that to life with a little bit of a metaphor that hopefully is going to fit with this room. It goes back to my little gold mining operation. I kind of wanted to use AI to show me in the excavator because it'd be kind of fun to go dig gold. But what are the excavators? They're the ones that move the raw material, the earth, right? So in your organization, that's how we identify agent candidates. And where's the work that can be, you know, assisting people, automating things, or augmenting the work that people do. Then we move on to the shaker table, where it separates the valuable material from just the waste, the dirt, right? In your portfolio, that mechanism is essentially going to be a scoring and prioritization tool that we're going to use. And we all know that not every idea is actually worth building. But if it gets past that shaker table, that's the filter mats. This is where we're going to catch the fine particles and the large nuggets, and we're going to make sure that we're not letting anything escape. That's the governance and kind of security controls that we're talking about. They're inside of those layers in the filter mats. And then finally, we're going to capture those nuggets. This is what you want to keep. Measurable business outcomes, real impact, and something that you can show back to your CFO so that we can get funding on some of these projects. So let's walk through each one of these stages. But before we do, I want you to do something inside your head. This is going to be a little silence for a second, but think about the work that you do in your organization that happens the same way every single day by hand. The workflow might be someone does 5 lookups to answer just one single question. I've done that. A report that takes 3 hours to compile because the data lives in 4 or 5 different systems. What about an approval that sits in an inbox for 2 days because no one's quite sure who owns it? So take a little bit. Think of one workflow where one mistake costs less than $1,000, maybe just 2, but it happens 100 or 1,000 times in a week. So that pattern, that low individual cost, that's cumulative drag on the organization. That's where your first nugget is probably hiding. So it's not in the flashy kind of transformation initiative. It's in the thing that's been quietly annoying somebody on the team every day for the last 3 years. I think of one of my favorite stories that we worked with one of our clients, and it was a transformational shift. All it did was one person's work, but it demonstrated that we could reduce the time that somebody was spending from 6 hours a day down to 15 minutes, and eventually down to like 5 minutes. And the end result wasn't they had to let somebody go, it was that they closed a job wreck. So those are the kind of impacts that can really sway an organization, because once that story manifested itself to the board, it became easy to go back and get more ideas funded. The first question, any portfolio conversation kind of comes up, where do you actually dig? I've got 3 different places that you can think about. First, frontline pain. So this is where the work is happening. Talk to your service desk. Look inside of your ticket queues. Walk the production floor. And I love actually getting out in front of the environment and looking at people and how they actually do their work. what it actually takes to get done. You see these patterns of doing it the same way over and over. Those are the areas that you're going to find a lot of these quick wins. Second, leadership themes. I've said this before in a lot of my conversations with my customers. The priorities of your organization are going to drive AI initiatives. If you can't define your North Star for me, what's important for your organization to focus on being successful, I'm not going to be able to help you prioritize accurately what kind of AI projects you should be funding. So if client says de-risk this process, or your CEO says reduce this cycle time, that tells me that those are strategic, important priorities for the organization, and those are the things that I want to look at because it's going to gain us momentum. And then third, I would look at like build events, structured type of time-boxed events that are going to generate just creative ideas. Hackathons, ideathons, people have a bunch of different names that they want to call them. But here's the caveat. Only run these if you're willing to take that output and feed a governed portfolio. A hackathon, and I see this a lot, that ends with a demo and nothing more is a waste of time. And so what we really want to do is get something that's going to go into a playbook that we can run later. So every candidate that you identify, I have this thing that I sort of built out for this. It's kind of an opportunity scorecard. And it looks at 5 different fields. The workflow touches the system and who needs access to it, the data it requires, what the control level is going to be, and most importantly, what the success metric's going to be for it when we're done. All right, so here's one that I actually worked through. Let's imagine that there's 47 field technicians, and they spend 8 minutes per shift just looking up the right work instructions. Through that process, they're doing things like calling their supervisors, they're digging through their binders, they're texting each other. Add that up. That's 900 minutes of cumulative drag every single day. So that's what this card is going to kind of reflect. So in the workflow, a technician that reports an issue and needs the correct SOP. Users are affected, the number of users affected, we've got 47 technicians and about 12 lookups per day. We're touching things like SharePoint for SOP documents, or we're going into ServiceNow to look at the tickets. Data required, 2,400 procedure documents, and about 80% of this we've identified as already being digitized. So I want to call that out because that's a readiness signal. That means, hey, look, I've got 80% of this already accessible to an LLM. Control level, 2 or 3, right? We're just basically looking at recommending the right SOP. We're not saying necessarily take any kind of actions. We're saying just give me some recommendations about what we should be doing so that I can act on it. Now look at that metric. So we reduced the lookup time from 8 minutes to maybe under 90 seconds, and we cut the supervisor escalations by 30%. That card took about 20 minutes for me to fill out, thinking about it out of one of these hackathons. But it can answer the questions that your IT lead, your security officer, or your CFO are going to want to ask before they approve any kind of pilot. So coming armed with this information is going to help you get this actually onto the shaker table, which we're going to talk about next. So once you have your candidate, now we've got to separate the gold from the gravel. And that's what that shaker table is supposed to do in the mining analogy. Is just shake that out, get the gold out of the dirt so we can start cleaning it up. And so here's a simple scoring model that you can use. And there's a bunch of different ones out there, but I had a meeting with one of my customers and he showed me what he's doing on his side. And so I've incorporated it into this other BXT thing that I've been doing. But still kind of similar. First, what's the business impact? So how big is the KPI that this agent could move? How many people, how many processes? What's the scale of this? Does it affect 3 people in one department? Because that's going to score differently than something that touches everybody in the organization. Makes a little bit of sense. Second, time to value. I had a talk about this, a webinar I did, talking about time to value, pro code versus low code. Nick, I know you're out there someplace, we'll talk later. Time to value, can you ship something meaningfully in a couple of weeks? Or is this something that's going to take a long quarter or even a half a year? Anything that gets into that inner ring should be something that you can ship in like 30 to 60 days, something achievable. Third, execution fit. Couple of different angles on this one. Is your data ready? Are you able to use it? Do we have a readiness score on the data? What about your staff? Are they able to handle those kinds of integrations? Are you going to pick a low-code tool because you don't have any software engineers? Is the process clear enough that you could write it down for a new employee? These are the things you want to make sure that you have for the execution fit. And then fourth, trust and risk. What happens if something fails? What's the blast radius on something like that? Something in our ladder on 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 that's just recommending something and it gets it wrong, that costs a minute. That's not a big deal. But something that's going to act is going to have much bigger blast radius. Something that can authorize payments and makes a mistake, that's a totally different category of risk and something that you're going to score differently. And then finally, what's that autonomy ceiling? Not where you're going to start, but where the ceiling is. Where do you envision this getting up to in the ladder? How high should you allow it to go? Some of the candidates should just stop at level 2 and stay there. You're never going to move and progress past it. But others, you're going to go up that ladder methodically so you don't get altitude sickness and that you can test and validate this agent as it goes through there. Let's look at a little bit of a live exercise. So I've got 3 different use cases up here. And I know I'm throwing a lot of frameworks at you, but I want to make sure that you can put these to use as well. As I go through each one of these, I want you to think back to the different rings that we had and vote inner ring, middle ring, or outer ring. For the first use case, imagine that you're a manufacturer. You got field technicians constantly that need the correct procedures for their equipment. Today, what they're doing is they're calling their supervisors and they're digging through their binders, and you want an agent that's just going to help them surface those work instructions when they describe the issues. So just real quick, inner, middle. Nobody's picking middle. Come on, let's get a vote here. All right, outer. All right, use case B. So you're an association or a nonprofit. Your members call, email about benefits, coverage, eligibility. You've got staff that spends a large portion of their time answering the same question from documents. You know those documents already exist. And so you really just want an agent that's going to answer questions and route the complex ones to somebody that's a little bit more knowledgeable in that area. Inner, middle, outer. All right, last one. You're in financial services. You file compliance documents, analysts draft them manually from source data, and attorneys review them. That's the important part. Attorneys are going to review them. You want an agent that drafts from the source data, flags anomalies, and cues the attorney for approval. So what do you think about this one? Is this inner, outer? I'm mixing it up. Paying attention. Middle? All right, so let's talk about how I would score these. So I feel like A is in that middle ring. The data in the inner ring, the data is just the documents. The control level is probably a level 2 or 3. It's just recommending and approve. Something like that is pretty much cookie cutter, and there's even tools that you can just off the shelf buy. You'll have something running in 30 days, no questions asked. B probably is like somewhere in the inner to middle, depending on how structured your data gets. So if you're in that area, I'd say that I'll give you both, the right one. But the C probably is in the middle ring. The compliance layer and the governance requirements, they're going to take some time to get right. But remember, I did say that attorney is going to be doing the review, so it's not actually autonomous. Regardless of whether you're right or wrong, whether you agree with my scoring or not, here's the key point, is that there's a framework for this and something that you should do intentionally. This is going to be valuable for your organization, whether you all agree on it or not, because the point isn't really whether it's in the inner, middle, or the outer ring. The point is the conversation that you're going to have with your teams, talking about why it should be in one of those areas. And so that's how you get organizational alignment before you start even spending a single dollar on these kind of projects and wind up flushing some down the toilet. Let me show you where the other side of the portfolio looks when it works. This was a pretty good story in the news. Klarna, they deployed an AI assistant that handled the equivalent of roughly 700 of their customer service representatives, full-time service agents. The resolution time, this was huge in the news, went from like 8 minutes to under 2 minutes by using these agents. And at the time, they reported millions and millions, I think around $40 million that they reported in profit improvement over this single year. That's huge. That's huge impact. And it got people talking about it. That's measurable. Let's take a little bit of a step out. Gartner predicts that more than 40% of agentic AI projects this year are going to get canceled. Not because the technology didn't work, but probably because of things like escalating cost or unclear business value or weak risk controls that cause problems within the organization. So the technology is often like the easy part. It's the discipline that's the hard part. And talking about Klarna, just to keep myself honest, they later adjusted that model. And if you remember, they reintroduced more human involvement for some of the complex tasks because of customer experience matters. It happens. But that's not really a failure. That's portfolio management, if you think about it. AI handled the repetitive work, got most of those things done, but they just misjudged what humans needed to handle and were over ambitious with it. So the system actually matured, and that's a difference. These kind of portfolio models that I'm giving you are going to help you establish that. So here's the question that the Gartner number, that 40% should make us ask. What did the nuggets do that the gravel didn't? So the canceled projects, those 40% that started with the technology, they saw a demo, and I know this. How many people have seen the demo and it didn't work, right? So they started with the demo. They stood up a pilot, but they never defined what the success criteria was. They never looked at what the finish line was gonna be. They funded everything and they prioritized nothing. And that's when the bill came due and they couldn't justify what they were spending their money on. The projects that succeeded, like Klarna, and the leaders that you're gonna hear from today on the executive panel, they started somewhere a little bit different. They started with a measurable workflow, a number that they were trying to move. Remember that one person, that job that we were trying to fill? Can I do something so I don't have to fill this job? That was the KPI. Do I have to fill the job? Simple. They scored their candidates before they actually built anything. And they had some of these governance patterns in place. So the second pilot was approved in half the time the first. When you have success stories that you can go back to your CEO and your board with, they're gonna improve more. And I've actually had them come back to these leaders and ask them, why aren't you doing even more? So the difference isn't the model, it's the operating model. And that brings me to the last thing that I promised I'd talk about today, a 30, 60, 90 plan. You know, a lot of you are looking for something that you can take out of here. And what's your first 90 days gonna look like? Feel free, take a picture. The first 30 days, I wanna encourage you to score 10 agent candidates using the frameworks that we've talked about. Make sure you use that opportunity scorecard. And we'll make sure we get you the slides, so if you missed taking a picture of some of this, we'll get that out to you. But then score them on the shaker table. Pick 2 that land in the inner ring, the ones that we're gonna get done fast and deliver value, and define their autonomy ceilings before you actually start building them. Then by day 60, see if you can get ship 1 or 2 of these into a controlled production environment. Human approvals in place, gotta keep that human in the loop, especially when you're getting started. Make sure you've turned logging on so that we can retrace our steps at some point, but real world data that's actually flowing through it. And at day 90, let's see if we can set a goal for standing up a monthly portfolio agent review. Are you getting enough ideas into your portfolio to be able to go methodically look through the value that's being delivered and make the decisions? Should we fund this one? Should we scale this one that we've already built? Should we kill this one that we delivered that isn't really generating the kind of KPI value that we said? Don't hesitate to make any of these decisions. This is a new territory that we're all in. We're not all experts in this because AI hasn't been around for 25 years. For us, it's been around maybe a little bit longer than most, but it is still a new technology. And here's the line that I really want you to take home. Momentum is cultural before it's technical, right? So build that momentum with your culture and make those shifts inside of your organization first. Gave you the map, but we're not done with the sessions, today. So I just want to give you a recap of what's coming up. The rest of today is about how you run each piece of the equipment without losing your limbs. The next session is going to go a little bit deeper into the governing and securing AI at scale. That's the full operational playbook behind the control model and the guardrails that we talked about. Then we're going to move into data and AI, creating great agents with trusted data. And trusted data multiplies the value of these great agents. So if your candidates keep landing in the outer ring of the shaker table, hopefully this session is going to help you understand why. And then finally, we've got that executive panel with Brian Atkinson from Atlas Energy, Michael Barrett from Pewaukee, and Hal from Clarios is going to be on the panel. These are 3 leaders that we've been working with that make real AI decisions inside of real organizations right here that you can reach out to and talk to. Well, want to use. Not quite right here. But anyway, these aren't theories. It's not just the slides. It's going to be actual conversations that they're having. So I'm going to close with that same thought that I started this off with, because I think it's even more true today. Those loud voices that are talking online, about that thunderclap, they want you to feel that there's some sort of urgency, that there's some sort of crisis. Why? Because urgency actually sells. But in the real world, here in this room, in the Midwest, these organizations, AI is about compounding quietly. It's about being slow and deliberate with your actions. So remember, from a manufacturing side, concrete does cure slowly, and so does transformation. But it does cure, and today is really about how you mix it. Thanks.